All right, let's get into section 6.4, talking about applications of integration area under a curve. And particularly when it comes to finance and economics, we're talking about consumer and producer surplus. So here you can see we have supply and demand equations, these functions given to us here in the graph. So supply increasing and then demand decreasing down here. Okay, and then this is our price axis, the vertical axis, and our quantity axis is horizontal. So the market is a very self-sustaining thing. So if left to its own devices, the market tends towards what we call equilibrium. So equilibrium, price, and quantity. And the notation we use for these, that's P star and Q star, like that. So those are equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, and that on the graph of supply and demand is the point where they intersect. So that is the value of P star, and that's the value of Q star. Okay, so that's that point right there in the middle where they meet. Okay. But just because we're at equilibrium doesn't mean that the market can't shift a little bit. It's just that it tends towards equilibrium. Equilibrium is kind of like the happy medium where everybody is pretty content with the way things are. And the key idea behind consumer and producer surplus is many consumers are willing to pay more than this, and many producers are willing to charge less than this. Okay, so in other words, the way that the market is settled right now at equilibrium, the consumers are paying so much for this product, but if they really had to, they would be willing to pay a little bit more. And same thing with the producers. The producers, if they are currently selling it at the price it's at, they might be willing to charge a bit less, right, if they had to. But this way everybody kind of wins. So the consumer surplus measures the consumer's gain. It is the total amount gained by consumers by buying the item at the current price rather than at the price they would have been willing to accept. Okay, so in other words, as a consumer, if I'm going to buy, a candy bar, say, I'm going to buy a candy bar. The current price for a candy bar is $1, and that's the equilibrium price. And so I say, okay, I'm going to pay that $1. I really wanted a candy bar. I would have been willing to pay up to $2 for this candy bar. Well, by that logic, I was willing to pay $2, but I only had to pay $1. So I actually saved myself $1, okay, by not having to pay that higher price. So that is my consumer surplus, maybe that $1 extra. If you take all of those amounts from everybody, then add all those up, that is the consumer surplus. Okay, and then the producer surplus, so the producer surplus measures the supplier's gain. It is the total amount gained by producers by selling at the current price rather than at the price they would have been willing to accept. So again, now I'm a supplier, I'm a producer, and I'm selling my product I'm selling my candy bars, for $1. But if I really had to, right, if the market dictated it, I could charge as little as 50 cents for my candy bar, right? So I'm willing to charge as little as 50 cents, but I didn't have to. I was able to charge a full $1. And because of that, I actually gained an extra 50 cents that I wouldn't have had if I had to charge the lower amount. Okay, that would be the producer surplus. Okay. Now, when we're looking at how to compute these, this is going to incorporate that concept of area under the curve. So if all consumers who were willing to pay more than P star, so equilibrium, paid as much as they were willing, then, let's do this in blue. So if all consumers who were willing to pay more than equilibrium paid as much as they were willing to, then total consumer expenditure would be equal to the integral from 0 to Q star of f of Q dq, which is the area under the demand curve from 0 to Q star Okay, so again, if consumers who were willing to pay more than equilibrium paid as much as they were willing to, then our total consumer expenditure would be the area under the demand curve from 0 to Q. Okay, so let's visualize this on our graph here. So here's our demand function down here. So this is going to be P equals F of Q. Okay, this is Q star. This is P star. Okay, so when we're talking about the total expenditure, okay, we're talking about the entire area under the demand curve up from 0 to Q star. Okay, so that would be the total amount spent by these consumers. So, if we're looking at consumer surplus, so the actual expenditure at equilibrium is the area of the rectangle P star Q star. Okay, so that's this rectangle right here. Okay, so this area, this is how much money they're spending at equilibrium, right? Because this is the equilibrium price. So this is how much money they would spend at equilibrium anyways. This whole thing is the total expenditure. So the consumer surplus, the amount that they're saving by spending here at equilibrium, instead of spending up at higher prices, that saved amount is going to be this area right up here. So it's all that area up there. Okay, oops. So this whole area is our consumer surplus. Okay, so consumer surplus at a price of P star is going to be the area between the demand curve and horizontal line at P star. Okay, so consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the horizontal line at P star. Okay, that's the total consumer expenditure minus the amount they're already paying. Okay, that gives us the total amount that they have saved. And then producer surplus, by a similar token, producer surplus, okay, the amount that they are currently charging, do this in purple, the amount that they're currently charging is based on the supply curve. Okay, so this is our supply curve. So that's going to be P equals G of Q. Okay. That's the total amount that they are spending, or I guess I should say making now, at equilibrium. Okay, so let's try this. So right now, the producers are making this much money, right? Because they're charging this many dollars for this many products. Okay, so the area of that rectangle is how much the producers are making right now. This beneath the supply curve is how much they would be making if they lowered the price as far as they were willing to go. Okay, so like again in the candy bar example, I'm currently charging $1. I would be willing to charge as low as 75 cents, 50 cents, 25 cents, whatever the case may be. So by selling it at this higher price, I'm currently saving myself or making myself more money than I would have otherwise. Okay. So now that gives us this area right here as the difference between the two. Okay, so this area right here, that is our producer surplus. Okay, so when we're looking at producer surplus at the price P star, this is the area between the supply curve and horizontal line at P star. Okay. So again, consumer surplus, what are all the people saving by spending at the lower price instead of what they would be willing to pay? Producer surplus, what are the suppliers making by selling at the slightly higher price than they would have been willing to otherwise? Okay, so let's look at an example, just a more graphical example. Given the supply and demand curves below at the equilibrium price, calculate and interpret the consumer and producer surplus. So here's our supply and demand, and our consumer surplus is going to be this area up here. Okay, so that's consumer surplus, and then our producer surplus is this area down here. Okay. Now in this case, because we have these different values, right, for P star and all of that, we can find these areas geometrically without having to do integration. So the consumer surplus, so this is the area of that triangle. Okay, so this triangle right here. So we find that area, that's going to give us our consumer surplus. So we need to know 1/2 base times height. So the base, this width down here, that is 0 to 80,000. So that's 80,000. And then the height, you got to be careful. It's not 240 because this is actually, the triangle doesn't start until 80 right here. So this is actually 240 minus 80, which is 160. Okay, which gives us 6.4 million. Okay, so 6,400,000. Producer surplus is found similarly, so it's 1/2 base times height, right? The area of this triangle down here. So that's going to be 80,000 by 80 this time. So producer surplus 1/2 80,000 by 80. So that's going to be 3.2 million. So it's half of the other. Okay. So now let's interpret. Let's talk about what this actually means. Okay, so let me get my typing down here. Okay. So this tells us that the consumers gain $6,400,000 in buying goods at the equilibrium price instead of at the price they were willing to pay. Okay, so the consumers, by paying equilibrium instead of what they would have been willing to pay, they saved $6.4 million. Okay, and then similarly, and producers gain $3,200,000 by supplying goods at the equilibrium price instead of at the price they would be willing to provide the goods. Okay. Oops. Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, so we got our consumer surplus. Told us that the consumers gained or saved $6.4 million in buying them at equilibrium, and producers gained $3.2 million by supplying the goods at equilibrium instead of at the price they would have been willing to do it. Okay? So let's look at another example, but first let's just touch on wage and price controls. So like I mentioned, the market tends towards equilibrium, and that's just the natural state of that. But there are outside factors that can also play a role in this. Oftentimes, that would be like governmental factors, things like this. So the price of a product generally moves to equilibrium price unless outside forces keep the price artificially high or low. Some examples of this would be like rent control, so artificially keeping the price of rent below market value, and cartel pricing or minimum wage law, which raise prices above the market value. So let's look at this example. So the dairy industry has cartel pricing. The government has set milk prices artificially high. What effect does raising the price to P plus from the equilibrium have on consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total gains from trade? When we say total gains from trade, this is just talking about, total gains from trade is just producer surplus plus consumer surplus. So it's how much money did everybody collectively save or lose. Okay, that's just total gains from trade. All right, so we're looking at the effect of the cartel pricing. So here's our equilibrium price down here. So we're saying the government artificially raised the price to P plus instead of P star, and we're trying to figure out what effect that has on all of our surpluses. Okay, so let's look at consumer surplus first. Sorry, these are kind of crammed together here, but I'm going to talk about consumer surplus in this space here, and then producer surplus down here. Okay, so let me just label these up really quick. So let's pull open this graph here. Okay, so here's P star, here's Q star, there's P plus. All right. So when we're looking at consumer surplus, okay, well, if we look on the other graph here, so again, here's P star, here's P plus, here's Q star. Normally, consumer surplus is going to be this. Right? This is the amount saved by the consumers by paying at equilibrium instead of the price they would have been willing to pay. Okay, so that would be normally what it looks like. However, with this cartel pricing, it's going to be the difference between the price that they are currently paying, right, which is no longer equilibrium, and the amount they'd be willing to pay. So that's going to be this area right here. Okay, so that is consumer surplus versus the consumer surplus, what it regularly is. Okay, so if we compare the two, you can obviously see there's a difference between these two areas. So since the consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and the current price, then we can see that this cartel pricing did have an effect on consumer surplus. It was a negative impact. So put this right here. So since consumer surplus is the area between the demand curve and price, and that would be the price being either equilibrium, P star, or P plus, okay, that raised price. So since consumer surplus is this area, consumer surplus is less than at equilibrium. All right. Then let's look at producer surplus. So let's look at these graphs here. So let's do this in purple here. Okay. So for producer surplus, so we have P plus, here's P star, here's Q star. Okay. Ordinarily, producer surplus would be the area between equilibrium and the supply curve. Okay. But now we're talking about a new price. Okay, so that would be P plus up here. This is where it starts to get a little trickier, because ordinarily, so this is producer surplus. But now we're looking for the area between supply and P plus. But we can't just shade in this entire area, because this part of the area is not beneath P plus, because P plus stops right here. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to draw in a new value that's going to come in right here. And this value is going to be called Q plus. This is the corresponding quantity that goes along with P plus. Okay, so the producer surplus is the area beneath P plus and above supply. So that's this area right here. Okay. So now, when we compare these two, the results are a little less clear, right? It's a little more of a gray area, I would say, because if we're just looking from area to area, this area here and this area here don't look that different, right? In fact, I would say that this one is probably a little bit bigger, but not by much, and if this value of P plus changes at all, this area could end up being quite a bit smaller than this one. So we just have to be careful. But that's kind of what we can say in our conclusion here. Okay, so let's go ahead and make that conclusion. All right, so since producer surplus is the area between price and the supply curve, in this case, producer surplus appears to be greater at the artificial price but this could change for different supply and demand curves. Okay, so if our curves are changing at all, then this could have an impact on what happens with this this producer surplus here. But currently it looks like it is helping the producers out a little bit. Okay, so now when we look at total gains from trade, so total gains from trade, that is, like I said, it's consumer surplus plus producer surplus. All right, so in this case, okay, so let's look at normally our total gains from trade would look like this. It would be the area beneath the demand curve and above the supply curve. So just the area between those two curves. Okay. So ordinarily, that would be our total gains from trade. However, at the altered price, okay, we have our P plus up here, P star, Q star. We have our new value Q plus in here. This is the area beneath demand, above supply. But now we're subjected to this additional constraint. So we have that area right there. Now, if we're just comparing these two to each other directly, I would say it's pretty clear which one of these has a larger area, right? It appears fairly significantly has a larger area, okay? So when we're talking about total gains from trade at the equilibrium versus artificial, it's pretty clear that equilibrium is better for everybody overall, right? When you combine all gains and losses. So total gains decreased. So the effect of the artificially high price on producers and consumers combined is negative. Okay, so overall, it looks like it's having a relatively negative effect on producers and consumers and on the market as a whole. Okay, and generally, that is the case. We like to let the market kind of tend towards where it wants to go towards because, again, equilibrium is kind of that happy medium where everybody is, not entirely satisfied. Like as a consumer, I'd like to pay less. As a producer, I'd like to charge more. But it could be worse, right? Everybody gets a little bit of what they want. So that's it for this section.